Hi and welcome to FMS Preview Part 2, a video this time where I will show you the takeoff calculations. So we're up for a very short test flight today with basically zero payload and only very little fuel, so the aircraft is very light. As you can see here in the fourth line of the takeoff reference 1 page, we are very light with a gross weight of only 160,000 kilograms. The maximum takeoff weight can be above 300,000 kilograms for a long haul flight if the runway is long enough. So this is really a light takeoff. So what can we do here? We can review our takeoff runway. This is runway 18 today, Frankfurt Airport that is. We can enter an override takeoff gross weight if we have a long taxi route to the runway and we'll have burnt off fuel when we reach the runway. We can enter an offset from the threshold of the runway if we taxi onto the runway at a later intersection and we don't have the full runway length. And on the second page we can enter various data like the wind on the runway, either as a wind direction and wind speed or as a runway wind component. This is tailwind and headwind. And we can enter the slope of the runway. Hey, this is X-plane, we have sloped runways, so we use them. And we can override the acceleration and thrust reduction altitudes. No, it's not altitudes, it's heights, because it's based on radial height and not on barometric altitude. Yeah, we can enter a headwind component for our takeoff, or we can use a direct wind entry like this. But let's calculate the V-speeds, because this is what we are interested in. So we're going to take off with flaps 5 and let's see what happens. Whoa! V-speeds unavailable. What is that? Okay, what happened here is the FMS calculated the speeds for V1, VR and V2, and they are very, very low because we are very light. And then the FMS calculates a value that is called V1 MCG, MCG for minimum control ground. So what is this speed? So V1 MCG is the minimum speed that you need to keep the aircraft under control in case one engine fails. Remember, we have two very, very powerful engines, and if one of them fails during the takeoff, it adds a considerable amount of yaw that we have to counter using the rudder. And the rudder's effectiveness is of course based on the airspeed. So the faster we go, the more effective the rudder is. So now there's a speed that we need for the rudder to be effective enough to counter the yaw moment of a failed engine. And this speed that we need is V1 MCG. So the FMS monitors V1 compared to V1 MCG, and it has to raise V1 to be always over V1 MCG, or otherwise we would take off, and in case of an engine failure we couldn't recover the aircraft. And there is certain limits to how much V1 can be raised. And obviously those limits were exceeded now, because the FMS tells us, no, you can't take off that way. Okay, so how do we take off? Well, we could board more fuel or ask our friends to come on board to make the aircraft heavier, but that's not a very good idea. So what can we do? We can reduce the takeoff thrust, because when the engines produce less thrust in the first place, if one fails, the differential will be lower, and with a lower differential we need less rudder effectiveness. With less rudder effectiveness we need a lesser V1 MCG speed, and we should be okay. So how do we reduce the takeoff thrust? We could enter an assumed temperature. because that's the normal way you do it. You say, dear FedEx, please assume it's 60 degrees outside, Celsius, 60 degrees Celsius. This is actually really, really warm. And throttle the engines so that they would be safe at 60 degrees outside air temperature. And this will be a considerably lower thrust. Okay, so we do this and we say, oh, it's 60 degrees outside. And we get a derated N1 of only 97.4%. And let's try again. So flaps 5, bam, still unavailable. Oh, what's that? Turns out it's not allowed to include assumed temperature takeoff calculations in the V1 MCG. Read it up in the manual, that's what the manual says, so we do it that way. So entering an assumed temperature for lowering the thrust is not enough to lower the V1 MCG. So what we have to do, we have to actually derate the engines via derated takeoff settings. So let's try this one. Whoa, that's a low takeoff N1, only 86.2%. Now that should be okay. Let's see. Again, flaps 5. Wow, it worked. 106 knots V1, 180 knots VR, 132 knots V2. Wow, we made it. We can take off. So I transfer the speeds to the PFD. And now we can take off. But I won't show you that because I'm only an FMC programmer and I can't fly, and you don't want to see me taking off. That's it. Bye bye. Stay tuned for the next episode.